My name's Will Inboden. I'm a professor here at the LBJ School and also affiliated with the Strauss Center, and it's a real honor on behalf of the Strauss Center and my Strauss Center colleagues to welcome all of you here. Our guest today is Peter Baker, who is currently the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. We're very privileged to have him. He's part of our ongoing speaker series and conversation series on issues of politics and law and international affairs and the like. And Peter's got a very distinguished background, 25 years as a reporter. He's been the lead White House correspondent for the Washington Post during the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, then transitioned over to the New York Times, where he's continued as lead White House correspondent there. He's widely regarded, he won't say this, so I will, widely regarded among both political types and media types in Washington as really the premier White House correspondent of his generation. And people who've worked in different administrations sometimes like what he writes, sometimes don't, but they'd all say that he's certainly known for being fair. And that's something that obviously is certainly an issue for others in the media. I'll also mention that aside from his White House and Washington experience, Peter is also something of a Russia expert. He and his wife, Susan Glasser, were the co-heads of the Post's Moscow bureau for a number of years and wrote a really excellent book following that experience on the sort of negative trends for democracy in Putin's Russia. So that might be a topic we'll want to address today. And I can put in a personal plug here that he probably wouldn't, which is I know a lot of you probably share my frustration that the New York Times is now behind a firewall and we have to pay our $12 a month to access it on the internet, but it's worth it alone just to read Peter's stuff. Yeah. So anyway, I'm happy to say that. Anyway, how we're going to structure this today is as a conversation. I'm going to start for the first, say, 20 minutes or so and have a few questions for Peter to get his thoughts on things, but then we want to open it up to everyone else here for any questions you might have for him, and he's assured us that he's happy to entertain questions on any number of subjects. He's in the reverse position. Usually he's the one grilling other people, so exactly. I'm sure that he's as deft as the politicians he covers at dodging something.
I'll refer you to my spokesman.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he'll refer us to the New York Times press secretary. So anyway. And he's going to have to head out right at about 1:15 sharp because he's doing a panel with Woodward and Bernstein over at the Ransom Center after this, so full day for him. Anyway. All right, well, please give a warm Strauss Center welcome to Peter Baker. Okay, all right, Peter, to start off, I think you've got a really unique vantage point from your time in Washington as someone who covered the Clinton White House, the Bush White House, and now the Obama White House. And through those experiences, you got to know all three presidents, you traveled with them, you got to know quite a few of their staff as well. And I think that's a really rare insider's vantage point. Looking back, how would you compare those three White Houses, the culture, the decision-making style? Do you see more similarities and differences or pronounced differences? Those of us who are now outside Washington see it from afar and filter through a particular lens, but up close like you were, what are your reflections on the differences among the three?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I hope, can everybody hear me? Is that okay? I don't know if this microphone's on. Thank you for having me. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here in Austin. I always enjoy coming down here. One thing about covering President Bush is you got a chance to come to Texas more often than you did with other presidents, and that's great. And particularly, I want to thank Will, who's always terrific to work with. He won't tell you this, but the rumor is not true that he was my secret source in the garage. I just want you to know that. Going to deny that right here.
But he was confirm nor deny.
But he was always very helpful and always willing to make sure that journalists had an understanding of how things worked in the White House as he saw it, and that's a great thing to do. A lot of White Houses can be a little nervous about the press, understandably, and Will understood intuitively that it's in the interest of any government organization to explain itself to the public, to help the public understand why it makes decisions, and then the public can decide whether the decisions are right or wrong with a more informed and educated view. And today he won't tell you this, but he's the lead organizer of a blog on foreign policy's website called Shadow Government, which includes a number of very smart and thoughtful people from the Bush administration giving their takes on today's foreign policy news, particularly in the way the Obama administration is handling. You should definitely check that out, foreignpolicy.com. I have no interest in that except that my wife happens to edit it. Your question is a great question, and one I think about a lot. It is interesting to see different presidents and different moments in time. It's hard to divorce the individuals from the issues and challenges that confront them in those moments. broadly speaking, I would say there's more commonality among presidents than not. Why is it that Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, who ran a horrifically tough campaign against each other, became friends after office? Why is it that Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush, and now George W. Bush, have become so close after they leave office? Because, in fact, ultimately, in the end, it's a very small club of people, and the challenges and the dynamics that they face and the difficulties and pressures of the office and the potential for good that they can do are pretty similar across lines of different administrations. The party differences matter a whole lot less, I think, once you're in that office and you understand what the challenges you face are, because American national interests, particularly in the foreign policy area, tend to be American national interests whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you want to forestall a terrorist attack in Times Square, and so on. And the resources that you have, the tools that you have available to you, the pressures that you face, the limits you have are the same whether you're President Clinton or President Bush or President Obama. Having said that, there's also some really interesting differences. They're different people. And a White House is the product of the personality of the guy at the top, and eventually the woman at the top. When I say guy, I mean that only because we have yet to get to the promised land. The President Clinton was, as you have probably seen yourselves and read books, he's a ferociously interesting personality. He has great intellectual appetites. He is a free-ranging thinker. He puts things together in ways that other people don't. For something that he noticed over here about the economy, something over here about Libya policy, and so forth. And he connects things in a very interesting way. A function of that, though, is that his White House was often tied up by the fact that he could see so many different ways of looking at a problem, and it sometimes had a problem coming to a conclusion. You know, he was really interesting in this way. We had what we called Clinton Standard Time, which meant that any event that he was planning to do was usually about an hour late, plus or minus 2 hours. And you could never guess when he was going to start an event or how it was going to go. And frankly, his own staff didn't know how a decision was going to go until he actually announced it, because he was prone to making changes right up to the last minute. He had decided in his second term he was going to make Sandy Berger his chief of staff in the White House right up to the moment, the morning of the announcement. The family's been cleared in to come to the White House for the announcement. He wakes up and he calls his outgoing chief of staff, "I've changed my mind, I want it to be Erskine Bowles." And Erskine Bowles was announced that day. So the White House learned that under President Clinton he was prone to thinking about things and rethinking things, and it was really, you can see the advantages and disadvantages of that, right? President Bush, by comparison, not only punctual, he is to the point where I came to interviews with President Bush and I would show up 10 minutes early and I was already late. He'd already started them. He believed very strongly, and Will can talk about this better than I can, in his idea of a very disciplined, orderly process. And a disciplined, orderly process meant you started a meeting on time, you finished it on time. Once you made a decision, the decision was made. It was then announced in a proper way. We didn't leak it to the press in advance, try to get a little extra spin. Everything had a sort of a rigorous kind of way of thinking. Now, again, you can see advantages and disadvantages in that, right? And I'll let other people argue about which is a better process. Obama, ironically, is somewhere in the middle in that regard. Mostly on time, mostly a disciplined fella, but also prone to thinking about things for a while before he kind of comes to a decision. You've seen that a number of occasions, whether it be the Afghanistan review, when he decided whether or not to send more troops. He took 3 months to do it because he really wanted to do it right in his view. He wanted to spend a lot of time on that. Again, you could say that's a good thing or you can say it's a bad thing, but that's a difference with him. Once he makes a decision, he's fairly strong on sticking with it. He doesn't tend to rethink it once it's there. So he's somewhere, in a way, in a cross between Bush and Clinton in a lot of ways.
Great, thanks. Following up on that a little bit, Peter, what would be one distinctive feature or attribute of each president as a person that you observed that you don't think was readily apparent to the American public? This can be positive or negative, but just something that was very evident to you from your vantage point that the American people probably didn't see.
Well, one thing you have to understand, of course, is that we don't get to see the presidents nearly as much as we would like. The process is, we're much more distant from them than we used to be, the press. And that's, our fault as much as anybody else's fault, because I think they're, with the proliferation of media and the constant competition and demands to get things out there, the notion that you could have sort of casual, kind of off the record or at least not very publicized encounters with the press diminished over the years. People who've covered it longer than I have would tell you stories about Reagan and the elder President Bush, kind of stopping in the briefing room or having casual conversations with them on the plane or something like that didn't end up becoming a big thing. When I started, Clinton, I remember, came back to the back of the plane and told a story on Air Force One, came back and told a story about something about Lawton Childs and coon hunting, and I don't remember what it was, but it was a very colorful Arkansas kind of story that involved some colorful language that wouldn't be used in public, and he just assumed that we wouldn't report that, and we didn't. We treated that as off the record. Today, that just couldn't happen. The nature of the relationship has changed, and that's for the worse, I think, honestly, for both presidents and for ourselves. We don't have that opportunity to interact with them in a way that doesn't get then blown up into the blogosphere and the TV in a way that makes them very reticent to talk. Characteristics that are different, though, a couple of things. I mean, one thing that's really interesting about Clinton is that he's such a richly interesting character and personality, very complex, multi-layered. And so you saw in public, for instance, this very sunny side for the most part. He was very good at I think, presenting an optimistic, positive, impression of himself and his policies. He would get out there, and he's great with crowds. He smiled. He was very gregarious, and what that masked to some extent was at the same time deep anger and grievance that he felt about some of the things that had happened to him in his presidency, and that he would express to his staff in private, outside of the range of the cameras. And so you had this sort of interesting balance between the genuinely, I mean, both sides are genuine parts of his personality, that neither one of them is artifice, but you had this part of him that was genuinely sunny and positive and affirming, which is how he becomes, I think, a popular president, because the public reacts to that. And you had the private side of him that's just sort of stewing over these things, the grievances, the various things that, whether it be Ken Starr or the Congress or what have you, that got him all worked up. I'm taking a long time. Bush,
No, that's good.
I think President Bush, again, Will would know this better than I do. I think he's a much more articulate, clear exponent of his ideas and his thinking than some of his television appearances might give you the impression. He's famous, of course, for some of his malapropisms, some of his, mangled terms and words, misunderestimated and so forth. And what you would hear a lot from people, and I saw this a couple times up close, is if the cameras were off and he wasn't with a crowd of people who was going to report it, he was a much more, clear thinker and speaker than you might think from some of the television things. And what you hear a lot from people like Will and people who work for him is, I wish the public could see what we see. I wish they could see this, because any illusions that he's not a bright guy are just dispelled by listening to him and hearing him. He's a different kind of intellect than President Clinton. I wouldn't want to compare them in terms of that, but he's a very smart guy, and I think he didn't communicate that as well, unfortunately for him, as the people who saw him. I often talk to Democrats who would go in to see him for some of these meetings, scholars and so forth, who had no great love for President Bush, and they would come out much more impressed than they had thought they would be by the level of his thinking. Even if they didn't agree with him, the level of his thinking and the way he approached a problem and his understanding and experience on things. I remember going to a meeting with him once. We talked about the economy, and he understood much more about it than I would have thought he did. Mind you, I don't understand anything about the economy, so it's, I guess, easy to impress me. But he's a much more fluent thinker than people understood. And part of that, again, is his own choice. President Clinton chose to show one side of his personality, not the other. President Bush, I think, very consciously decided to lower expectations for himself. He played to this sort of this anti-elitism, this anti-intellectualism nature of his persona. I'm just a C student. I'm not with the. Never mind, he went to Harvard and Yale, and obviously, has great credentials himself. He would get up on these speeches all the time, and he'd be up there with some great professor, and he'd say, here's a guy with 3 degrees, and here's a C student. Which one is president? I mean, he played off this sort of like average Joe kind of guy when he wasn't obviously an average Joe. President Obama is different than both of them in that he is, I think of him as an introvert. I don't think you don't normally think of introverts as being politicians. If you use the definition of introvert as, the definition of an extrovert is somebody who gets energy from other people, and the definition of an introvert is somebody who expends energy when he's with people, or she is with people, and needs time to recharge. President Obama is certainly the latter. Not to say he doesn't enjoy people, he does, of course, but his if he goes into a room like the East Room and he does a big event and he shakes hands and so forth and everything, it takes him a few minutes afterwards to kind of recharge his batteries, kind of get himself pumped up again. Whereas Bush and Clinton, they love the room. They love, particularly Clinton, loved the crowd and the rope line and the affirmation of the people and so forth, and they really got pumped up afterwards. Obama's the opposite of that. I think he has a greater interior life, and he holds that back from people, and he's not as I don't think he's engaged in the rope line nature of the job.
All right, Peter, a couple of normative questions, which I know you reporter types are a little leery of. Comparing Bush and Obama, same question for both of them. What do you think was Bush's best foreign policy moment and his worst foreign policy moment? And with Obama, what was his, thus far, best and worst foreign policy moments?
Well, those are really interesting and tough questions, and it's not for me to judge good and bad, which is kind of hard, because as a reporter, it's my job to report on them. I think you can. There are things about Bush's foreign policy that people don't know about that I think most people who study this would say are successes that are, like, for instance, he did a lot to build relations with India, and that's not front and center of his public persona. Obviously, we think of Iraq, we think of Afghanistan, North Korea, and Iran, perhaps. He spent a lot of time building relations with India that to this day, has changed our nature of interactions with the world's largest democracy, and that's important. I think his most defining, if you take out the Iraq War for a second, which is a thing to itself, and people will debate that for decades, his most defining foreign policy achievement is probably the wrong word, but is how he repositioned us after 9/11 to think about the world and how we have to confront a new type of enemy and a new reality that we hadn't really focused on as definitively prior to 9/11. And that has been continued to this day. President Obama obviously ran on a different platform, and he ran against a lot of what Bush did, but he's adopted a lot of what he was found left for him in the Oval Office when he arrived, when it comes to counterterrorism, when it comes to the war on terror. He might not put it that way. He would tell you he's rethought it in some ways, and he has, but a lot of what President Bush had put in place when it comes to that was kept in place after he left. And that you might not have thought that 3 or 4 years ago. You might have thought things would have been much more radically different. And I think that obviously is any president who leaves something behind that his successor more or less keeps in place has achieved something. President Obama is very early on, obviously. I think that what he's achieved, I think you could say fairly, is that he restored some of the bad will, he restored some of the goodwill around the world for the United States, to the extent that President Bush left a lot of burned feelings in different parts of the world, Europe in particular. President Obama, just by virtue of his election and by virtue of being a different guy and a different personality, was able to come in and take advantage of being the new guy and creating a new relationship, whether it be with Russia, whether it be with the NATO allies, and with a lot of countries around the world that had grown quite distant from us, fairly or not, under Bush. And so clearly I think that's an important change that he has brought in. A lot of the other things he's tried to do, it's a little early to judge. He hasn't obviously convinced Iran to give up his nuclear weapons any more than President Bush has. He hasn't, and he's found himself once again in a third war, unfortunately, and now in the Middle East, that he's finding, he's trying to figure out how to confront. He's done it differently than President Bush in some ways, but once again, we're in a situation where we don't know how it's going to end, and it's an uncertain battle. I don't know if that answers. I hope that answers a little bit.
Well, a little bit, and if people didn't like it, you'll be free to follow up. Like I said, when we open up to questions from the audience. A question or two on the role of the media in a free society, and particularly your role here. It's no secret that different White Houses will have different reporters who are on their good list or their bad list, or unofficially, or favorites or not. Some who they feel like they can count on.
Which list was I on?
Wait till the archive's open, right? And I'm sure you experience quite a bit that different White Houses will perhaps try to work with you, to use a neutral word, to shape a story in their way. Obviously, you have to balance. You need access to get those stories. On the other hand, in a free society, the press has to play some sort of independent media role. How do you balance that? How do you resist manipulations and the like from a White House trying to shape a story with the need that you still have to have that access there?
Right. It's a fundamental. It's a fundamental issue for any White House reporter. Exactly that. Accountability and access. And the truth is, we're responsible for both, and we can't. Any reporter who tries to do one over the other is going to realize that he hasn't been successful in that job. Now, there are investigative reporters who can only do accountability, and that's great, but they're not covering the beat. And there are people who do only access, and that I think produces some interesting journalism, but I think abrogates a lot of your responsibility as a reporter. And my hope is, and my feeling is, going into these things, if you're honest with people, if you're straightforward with them, and you deal with them upfront and fair, they respect pieces that aren't pieces that they necessarily like. That if you give them every opportunity to present their point of view and you let them have a say in the article, that they understand that we have a different job to do, and that it's not our job to be their PR agents, and that as long as we have treated them fairly and not, and not pull fast ones on them, then that they're going to. My argument to every White House has been: the more you talk to me, the better it's going to be for you, because the more people will hear your voice and hear you explain your policies. And it is part of my job to help a White House explain its policies, or at least to explain how the White House sees its policies, and then to find other voices that will, give you other points of view and to criticize and or explain or contextualize a policy. So, I try not to be anybody's friend, but I also try not to be anybody's enemy. And I think if you don't personalize these things, the real professionals in any White House understand that you both have a job to do. The jobs are different. That they can have shared moments where your jobs, have mutual benefits, but that ultimately we have different points of view.
Have you ever written a story that you later realized you got wrong?
It's a great question, because once President Bush was asked by another journalist, not by me, what was your biggest mistake or what was your biggest regret, and he couldn't think of one. And Will's colleague, Peter Fever at Duke University, asked me this very question a few weeks ago, and I had no answer. I was very Bush-like. The truth is that I think every story is wrong on some level. I hate to say it. Every story is flawed in some level. There's no such thing as a perfect news story. Every story captures only a fraction of what is really happening out there. And every story is written to some extent on a deadline. Even magazine stories, which I write these days on a longer term basis, is by definition flawed, because you haven't talked to every single person, and you haven't had infinite time to talk to every person. Now, are there specific stories I've gotten wrong? Probably. There's one I think of, for instance. I once wrote a speech, President Bush gave a speech in which he said, by the end of the year, I want us to have turned over more than half of Iraq's territory or provinces, I can't remember how he defined it, to the Iraqi security forces. And I thought, well, I hadn't heard him say that before. That's a really interesting. He set a goal. He set a timetable, in effect. We should write that story. And I asked, in my defense, I asked a couple people at the White House, is this the first time he said this? And they said, yes, the first time he said this. And I looked, but I didn't look very hard. So it's front page story, for the first time, President Bush sets a goal of da-da-da-da-da. And darn if he hadn't said the same thing 2 months earlier in a speech that I didn't go to and I hadn't seen. And once I realized that, I went back and looked. Nobody covered it. Like, not a single media person. We were total broke down and failed in that instance. Not one of us wrote a story about the first time he said it. So it's, if a bear makes a speech in the forest and nobody writes about it, does it count? I don't know. But it was hugely embarrassing. Right there on the front page, the very first words of the story, for the first time, wrong.
All right. A question on something we've talked about before, which is the role of history in an administration, and this is something you've also written on. Knowing the Obama administration as you do, and even President Obama, President Obama seems to have a certain historical consciousness. I know when he came into office, you would see some comparisons, perhaps to President Lincoln, perhaps to FDR, particularly in relation to the Depression, the New Deal, and the economic crisis. Some of President Obama's critics, on the other hand, like to attach the Carter label to him and the analogy there. You might recall an article you wrote a year and a half ago about Afghanistan, comparing it perhaps to Vietnam and saying, will Obama be another LBJ? Of course, that's a sensitive topic here because we are at the LBJ school. I'm sure you meant that as a compliment.
I meant that as a compliment.
That's right. Not just to Lincoln, but an LBJ. Anyway, what is your sense? How much does a concern about how he will be regarded in history play into President Obama's mindset and his staff, and what sort of analogies do you think they are trying to steer towards or away from?
It's a great question. It's funny. In covering 3 presidents, I've never seen anybody analogize to other presidents quite as much as President Obama has. It's funny. Everybody's trying to find a parallel. We didn't do that quite as much with Bush. I don't think we did that quite as much with Clinton. I could be wrong, but I remember some of that. Clinton ultimately tried to. His own personal goal was to be Thomas Jefferson, because Clinton. But then he couldn't pull that off because, for a lot of reasons. So then he was thinking Theodore Roosevelt. And his Teddy Roosevelt analogy was because Roosevelt really is the only president we think of as great who didn't really have a war that he fought. He governed in times of peace and yet still managed to make great change in America. And he presided over, the shifting of the country's economy and status in the world. And so Clinton wanted to be another Teddy Roosevelt. President Bush, famously, of course, had Lincoln bust in his office, read a lot of books about Lincoln, really took, I don't want to say he saw himself as Lincoln, but he took a lot of solace in the dark days even from Lincoln's experiences because, obviously Lincoln went through a pretty horrific time in 4.5 years in office, and there are certainly moments like that for Bush when things look pretty grim. So in some ways, it's not just a matter of how you analogize yourself, it's how you draw comfort from your predecessors. Now, I asked President Obama about this last fall. And last fall, he was reading a book about President Clinton, which is kind of ironic, Taylor Branch's book called The Clinton Tapes. And it was ironic, of course, because President Obama had spent his campaign basically kind of deriding President Clinton to some extent, right? He was running against his wife, and he talked about how Reagan was a transformative president, but not President Clinton, and how he didn't want to do small ball or incremental stuff or triangulation. And here he was last fall about to suffer a midterm election that was pretty similar to what President Clinton suffered, and he was now suddenly finding great benefit in looking back at Clinton's experience and how Clinton tried to pivot after that experience. I think that all the analogies are false and all the analogies are too simple. The LBJ analogy I met was, could it be that he would be a president who accomplished big things on a domestic front, right? President Johnson, obviously, on civil rights, Medicare, Great Society, did a lot to change American society at home, and yet had this horrifically disastrous war abroad that that to this day takes away from a lot of the things he did that people would agree with. And Obama at the time, of course, had put in this health care program, which, whether we like it or not, is a big deal and a big change in society. Maybe it'll be a disastrous one, maybe it'll be a good one, but from his point of view, it was a big deal and the biggest social program any president had put in place, frankly, since LBJ. And yet he had Afghanistan, which, is that going to be a Vietnam? That's probably, again, too simple. We don't have nearly the number of troops in Afghanistan that we had in Vietnam. It's not nearly the same level of casualties and so forth. And yet, could a foreign policy problem like that take away from all the things he wants to accomplish on a domestic level? That was the analogy I was looking for. I think these days they're looking at Reagan. These days you would hear the Obama people saying he could be like Reagan, partly because they look at how Reagan came back from a tough economy in the beginning of his presidency to win re-election, and partly because they view Reagan as a leader who transcended his own ideology to bring the country in a different direction without losing them. And that's at the moment the one that I think that they look at the most.
And just one follow-up on that, and this will be my last question before we turn it over to the audience. So President Obama has a very full plate. He's got a pretty packed inbox. He's got still difficult domestic economy problems, unemployment, the debt, the deficit, S&P downgrades, but he's also got arguably 3 wars going on, depending on how we want to define Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan.
It's a kinetic action.
That's right, yeah. 3 kinetic actions going on, yes. 3 police actions going on, right. Do you think that he sees himself primarily as a domestic policy president or a foreign policy president? Sort of when he, is laying in bed at night, going through his head. Where do you think his real mentality is? Realizing that he has to pay attention to both.
Well, it's so interesting because presidents come into office thinking they're going to be one thing and it often becomes something else, right? Mm-hmm. President Bush came to office in a time of peace and prosperity and thought he was going to be a domestic policy president, right? He was going to do tax cuts, he was going to do Medicare, prescription drugs, no child left behind. Suddenly 9/11 happens. It's a very different presidency. This president, President Obama, has had several iterations of this already. He started off as a foreign policy candidate, right? His primary argument in the Democratic primary was, I got Iraq right. I said Iraq war was a bad idea, and Hillary didn't, and the other candidates didn't, and you should elect me for my good judgment on this. And then by the time the election happened, of course, Iraq was no longer a front burner issue. The surge had come along, violence had decreased, and the economy had gone in the tank, and suddenly he was an economic president, right? And I think he has seen himself primarily as a domestic policy president, doesn't want to be a war president, and yet it won't let him go. The reality of the world doesn't allow you necessarily to define your presidency the way you always want to define it. He's very different than President Bush in the sense that he doesn't talk about Afghanistan or Iraq or even Libya now with great regularity. President Bush, in the second term, when I was covering in particular, I don't think he ever gave a speech where he didn't talk about Iraq. I mean, he may have been talking to you about immigration, but somehow Iraq would come into the equation. It was part and parcel of everything he was doing and thinking of. President Obama, the number of big speeches he's given on Iraq, you could count on one hand probably, and the same, somewhat more with Afghanistan because it's a hotter issue right now, but he doesn't really spend his time publicly drawing attention to it. Now, is he spending private time on those things? Of course he is, But I think he doesn't want his presidency to be consumed by these wars the way he feels President Bush certainly was in the second term. President Bush in the second term couldn't get a lot done on the domestic front because Iraq just was everything. And President Obama wants to sort of avoid that. But the world doesn't let you get away with that as easily as you might want it to.
Thanks. All right, any questions from the... yeah, Sherry.
Well, just one observation when you were talking about the three presidents, Bush, Clinton, and Obama, and their personalities and ways of relating to the world. I served in the Texas legislature when Bush was governor. And one thing that I think people weren't aware of unless you had been working with him was that he's always been what I call a retail politician. Mm-hmm. Yes, he's an expert, but he's a retail politician. And his mode of operating was always not on the wholesale big crowd, but one-on-one.
Yes.
And one of the brilliant moves he made when he was first elected governor here was to try to go and visit each member of the Texas House, 150 of us, and each member of the Senate. And if you were, for instance, working on something, I was chairman of pensions and investments, and he wanted to talk to you about something, he'd call you up, you'd go over to his office one-on-one. And so I think that is something that sets him apart from Clinton. Mm-hmm. Yes, they're both extroverts, but Clinton, sure, retail one-on-one, but great as far as wholesale politics, and I think Bush's specialty was that.
Let me ask you, can I ask you a question? Because I'm curious about this. Do you mind if I...
You can't ever get a reporter without your mic. Fine, go ahead.
Governor Bush, of course, works relatively well with Democrats in Texas, Bob Bullock, the lieutenant governor, and so forth, Pete Laney. And he promises to be a United Advisor, comes to Washington, and it doesn't work there. And Mike, I'm curious as to what you think. I always think, well, that's because a Texas Democrat, the most liberal Texas Democrat, is probably the most conservative, New Hampshire Republican, and Washington is a different place than Austin. But I'd be curious why you think that didn't translate.
Well, certainly that's part of that. You're referring to the old Dixiecrats.
Yeah.
But also, necessity is the mother of invention. And when he was first elected in Texas, he had a Democratic House of Representatives
right.
that he was dealing with.
Right.
So the majority of the House was Democrats. Pete Laney, the Speaker, was a Democrat. When he went to Washington, that wasn't the case.
Right. Do you think part of it, he would have been better off if he had a Democratic Congress or a Democratic House or Senate, just to have somebody to play off of?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, right here.
How has digital media changed the way you do your job, and how do you feel about that?
It's a great question. When I started out, I started out as a reporter in 1986, and we had this quaint idea of our job. Our job was to go to work, we'd cover a story, around 5 o'clock or so, you sit down and write it, you turn it in, you go home and have a beer. Today, I wish.
Or 2 or 3.
Or 2 or 3, yeah. Today you begin the beer much earlier. The truth is there's no such thing as a deadline anymore. It's just always there. There's no such thing as a single day. On a given day, if I'm covering the White House and it's my duty day, we trade off, I could write 2, 3 items for the web. I could do a podcast. I could do a TV hit from our own little mini studio in the New York Times bureau there. And I could do a radio interview, and I could do that all before even thinking about what to write for the next day's print newspaper, which we still want you to buy. And it's very, very mind-blowing. You don't have a chance to sit down and think at times, and that's a real cost to journalism. Right now, what we have to do as journalists is make sure to find ways of avoiding the trade-offs, right? The speed can't kill depth. We have to make sure we do both. It's really hard. I was at the NATO summit with President Bush, I remember in 2006, and I had the New York Times, I was with the Washington Post, and the New York Times had 3 reporters there, and I had just me, and I was pool, and pool means we take turns when you're actually up close with the president, because you can't have all the reporters up close to him, and when you do that, you have to send out reports to your colleagues of what you saw, whether you're on Air Force One or in some photo op. So I had, that day, I filed 7 pool reports, 4 blog items, 3 web stories, 2 print stories, and a podcast, or something like that. And there's a turtle dove in there somewhere. And it's just mind-blowing. And so what you bring up is a huge challenge that we're trying to figure out how to address.
In the yellow shirt.
I'll counter that question. You spoke about the difficulty of accountability and accessibility. What's your position on WikiLeaks? I know this is a tough question for New York Times in general, but I'll say, how has it affected your reporting? How has it affected the atmosphere in Washington? If you can, what's your personal opinion about it?
Right.
I didn't plant that question.
I know, it's on his list. I saw it on the list.
Yeah, so.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
It's a great question. And WikiLeaks is a very complicated and interesting issue. But in essence, it's really an extension of issues we've always had, which is that people in government leak us things that maybe they shouldn't leak us, but it's our job to provide news, not to protect the government's secrets. And I think what WikiLeaks has actually shown is something very interesting. Because of the proliferation of media, because of all the different websites and TV and all the different types of things, the old filter is gone. It used to be that if the editor of the New York Times or Washington Post made a decision about a story, that pretty much governed whether it would be out there or not. And I remember in 1996, Bob Woodward, who's going to be here on campus today, investigated whether Bob Dole had an extramarital affair in his first marriage before Liddy Dole. And he determined that he had, and interviewed the woman who he had the affair with and got her to come clean and be public, and to agree to be interviewed and be on the record, and wrote a story. And Len Downey, who was the editor of the Washington Post in that time, 1996, decided not to run it. And he decided not to run it because he gave it a lot of thought. What is the public interest in this? What is our news judgment about this? There had not been any example in that case of Dole having to testify under oath, for instance, incorrectly, as President Clinton obviously did. There was no investigation that brought a government agency in. It was a personal foible. There didn't seem to be any pattern of this kind of behavior. And Dole had been relatively quiet about Clinton's, so he couldn't, it was hard to make the hypocrisy argument too strongly. So Downey decided not to run it, and it didn't run. And that was it, pretty much, In this day and age, there's just no way that could happen. There's just no way that one editor could make that decision for us. And so, but what was happening with WikiLeaks is actually sort of, in theory, both the biggest example of that, in which there is no filter anymore, right? But also a heartening lesson. I'm going to tell you this interesting thing. When WikiLeaks put out the first batch of documents about the Afghan war, they didn't scrub them very carefully. And a lot of Afghans who were in them, who had been our informers, their names were in there, and the Taliban said, well, we're going to go through those and find those people and kill them. It's a terrible thing. And WikiLeaks learned something from that. By the time we had this last dump, this 250,000 State Department cables that came out, they only posted what we posted. And we only posted the cables that we reported out. We went through cables, and we found cables that told us something that we decided was newsworthy. Then we reported it out with people in the government and out of government. We did our due diligence, so we had a full story, not just what the cable said. And if we decided there was news that the public had some interest in and a right to know, we published it, and then we would post that cable. And only then, by the way, did WikiLeaks post that cable. Only about 2 or 3% of those 250,000 cables have actually come public. They didn't suddenly put everything online. They decided to defer to the judgment of the newspapers, both us and our European colleagues. Once again, the filter actually come back, I think in a good way, because it meant the professionals were making a professional judgment. Now you can argue we shouldn't be doing it anyway. These are classified documents and so forth. Fair enough. We can have that conversation. But at least in that case, I think there was a process in which news professionals evaluated the newsworthiness of the documents, reported it out, talked to the government. In some cases, the government explained to us why they thought there would be some danger if something was published, and we sometimes agreed with them and withheld things, and sometimes we didn't. But a process went. It wasn't just willy-nilly throwing everything out there. So I think that's good. I think that's good. And I think that while if I'm a diplomat, I'm going to be unhappy about WikiLeaks being having all those documents out there, I think it also tells us something about how our government works. And I think there's value in that. And I think that, in fact, I was kind of heartened by it because I was an overseas correspondent, and I would interview these diplomats. I'm blabbing too long. I would interview these diplomats, and they would just say these ridiculous things about the countries they were in. And you walked out of their office thinking, did they really believe that? Did they really believe that this tin pot dictator is actually fostering civil society and democracy in this country? Even off the record, they would say stuff like that. And I have to say, I read some of these late cables, and I'm heartened to realize they don't think that. And they're just lying.
All right, I apologies
Sorry.
for the moderator's prerogative here. I've got to interject and follow up on this. So we just heard, I think, a fairly compelling defense of the good that WikiLeaks can play in more government transparency.
I'm not defending WikiLeaks. I'm defending what the New York Times has done with
New York
WikiLeaks.
Times. Okay, all right.
Different
I
things.
personally have always been interested in learning more how the New York Times and the media work. So if a Wall Street Journal reporter were to get access to Peter Baker's email account and learn who Peter Baker's anonymous sources are and that kind of stuff, and say publish a story saying, here's how one of the best White House correspondents does his business, like, would that be protected by the First Amendment, and would that be a stride for free speech?
The publication of it, as far as I'm concerned, would be protected by the First Amendment. I don't know whether there was any illegal activity in hacking an email account. I mean, the activity of if somebody literally took a hacksaw to the New York Times bureau in the middle of the night, came into my computer and literally steal it, that's a crime under anybody's circumstance, right? But if they got them and they published them, obviously, I think there's no First Amendment bar to that. That would be news, arguably, about how the news media works. I wouldn't be happy about it.
Okay, all right.
I would be deeply unhappy about it. If the government did, that's a different thing, right?
Okay.
No, I mean, but we agree with that. We agree that there's a difference between a government seizing a newspaper reporter's sources and,
there's the coercive element.
Yeah, I mean, that's the use of power as opposed to, a report. This is actually happening, by the way. There's a story about this. My colleague, Mark Leibovich, works for the Times. He's writing a book. He got a guy on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, an aide to a top congressman, to forward him emails that he was getting from other reporters. Because he's writing a book about the culture of Washington, and he wanted to write about how these reporters will suck up to spokesmen, and spokesmen will manipulate the reporters. And that's a legitimate topic of scrutiny, by the way. We ought to be scrutinized the same way government is. I've got no problem with that. And our friends at Politico, very good friends of mine, made a big stink about it. How dare you forward these emails, and the spokesman got fired. But the truth is, I'm like, I don't put anything in an email I don't think is going to come out. Every email I send to the White House is going into the National Archives, will be public someday.
Yeah, so, all right. Well, any of my students here who are computer savvy, that's not permission to hack his account. But anyway,
Please.
Okay, we had a follow-up from Sherry and then Celeste. Okay.
This is just a quick follow-up to that, but my point being, and you really touched on it, emails now, we have had WikiLeaks, and in fact, we did it on here, but we've also had here in Austin what I'll call city council leaks. Emails are subject to open records requests, and so I think the idea that somehow emails are off the record or anything like that is just totally false.
It's an old thinking, and
It is.
particularly for government. I mean, let's face it, government, this is how our government, with our taxpayers, is doing business. We do have there's an obvious public interest in how government operates. But I think even news media, frankly, if I put something in an email and it gets published somewhere, I'm going to be mad, but I should have nobody to blame but myself if I said something I shouldn't have said.
Right, I always say think before you push that button because the whole world has it, and there are many, many times where I'll receive an email from someone and I will reply back, here's my phone number.
Yeah, call, yeah. Nobody can publish your phone call.
Okay. Celeste.
Well,
All right, it's not as easy.
Okay, I have two, but I'll make them really quick. In
2010, Michael Hastings from Rolling Stone writes this article about McChrystal, ends up getting McChrystal fired. And afterward, Hastings was savaged by his fellow journalists, right? I mean, in several public forums, other journalists came and were sort of yelling at him and telling him that he had sort of defied the code, and he had ruined it for all of them, and he's really been treated pretty badly by a lot of the establishment defense reporters. So I'm just kind of curious what you think about that. Did he do the right thing? Did he do the wrong thing? Was he the first person to do the right thing, or did he really cross some line? I'd just be interested in your view on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. And of course, the Pentagon has just released a report in which they say they cast some doubt on things that he wrote. Right. The truth of the matter is, I mean, I don't know what you've said is true. I don't know how much he got excoriated because I don't know him, and so if he's gotten excoriated, that in my view, he's a reporter, and I don't know what bargains he made with his sources. I mean, if you make a bargain with a source, you need to keep the bargain with the source. I mean, if a source says you cannot publish this, or you can only publish this when you identify me thus and such, and you do something other than that, I've got no sympathy for you as a reporter. But as far as I know, I don't think he did that. I mean, I haven't seen any. I'm not very versed on it, so maybe I could be corrected. I have not seen anything that makes me think that he did anything wrong. I think that in fact his article has been oversimplified. When I read his article, I thought it was fascinating, not because of the stuff that became the big thing. I think he actually raised several very interesting points about the nature of the conflict in Afghanistan at this point. For instance, General McChrystal's edict about how far, the rules of engagement, how far troops should go in their own defense, and the troops below him who were unhappy about that conflict was fascinating and very important for our country. So I don't have any, I mean, like, if people said these things and he was in a position where he was a reporter and they knew he was a reporter, that's the way it goes. And the Pentagon report, I don't know the details. They've investigated and I haven't. But it wouldn't surprise me that people wouldn't own up to having said things that was in an article like that. So.
One more.
My other question was, you've been in Washington for a long time, and you deal with a lot of staff people and a lot of political appointees. In your time there, how do you think Washington has changed? I have a perception, and that is that there used to be a lot of people who came into administration from the outside, right? Outsiders, people who had out of the middle of American society, came into Washington,
like professors.
and then went back home, like professors, right?
What do they do?
Now you have this kind of growing class of inside the beltway, pundits and experts that probably think things, and that nobody has to go home anymore. And they've kind of made a profession out of being the punditocracy. Do you think that's true? I mean, is that your perception as well? And what impact do you think that would have if that's true?
I think that's a fair observation. I would want to see numbers or quantify it or see a more study before I say for sure. But my impression is the same as yours, that there is more and more a permanent class of people who work in government. And if you're a Democrat and a Republican in office, you go to a think tank and you wait out 4 years or maybe 8, depending on how well your party does. And now the Republicans are out of office and they're kind of waiting. Not will, but a lot of them are waiting for the next one to come along.
Very happy with my day job.
And there's increasingly, I think that's the case. And there are numbers I saw recently, I don't remember what they are, of the congressmen who lost or didn't run in last fall's election. Like of the 100 and whatever it is, like a substantial number of them are already now working as lobbyists in Washington. So it's changing. I think that does change things.
We've got one in the back here. And
I'd like to follow up on the previous question about the diversification of media and ask you particularly about the role of the cable talk, news-ish kind of shows and how they seem to drive the agenda somewhat, and then the impact of social media on reporting.
Right. Oh, very good questions. I think cable talk obviously has driven a lot of the conversation. We can have a whole day about some event that would be a brief in the New York Times or Washington Post, and suddenly is the biggest thing in the world if you watch the cable TV. And for us, there's an interesting challenge. How much do you exercise your own news judgment about these things, and how much do you have to respond to the fact that whether you like it or not, the country is talking about it?
And whether you like it or not, Glenn Beck said it.
Whether you like it or not, Glenn Beck said it, or Chris Matthews, or even not even the talk shows, just the constant repeating of what stories like the woman killed in a Caribbean island or whatever, things that are not like some tabloidy kind of story that the New York Times generally doesn't spend a lot of time on, or how much do we have to address the fact that the country's talking about it? And that's a perennial challenge, I think. I hope we exercise our own judgment. as much as we can, and make sure that whatever reporting we do on these subjects is fact-based and scrutinizes the easy pop-off nature of cable talk, rather than simply falls into this stream of it. But at the same time, you can't ignore it. I mean, like, you know, we were accused of ignoring some of the things that were said on Fox about some of the Obama White House people, and that's fair enough. We ought to be looking at these things, and if we decide after looking at them that there's nothing to it, we should write that. You know, whatever we find, we should write and help the reader, rather than, you know, simply pretending something doesn't exist, but put it in the right context. Not easy.
And social media?
Social media, boy. Yeah, this whole Twitter thing, man. They talk about no time for editors. I mean, people are just sending stuff out, and there's no filter at all. What was the filter? We're talking about the filter. Talk about no filter. You know, look, social media is valuable. Social media is a tool. It is a tool, and we in the legacy media or whatever obviously need to be careful about how we use it, but we can't pretend it doesn't exist there either. You know, we've got more Twitter followers, apparently, they tell me, than any other news organization. We have 3 million Twitter followers at the New York Times, which boggles the mind. I have people following me, but I've never sent out a tweet. I have I have a Twitter account because the White House has a Twitter account, and they send stuff out on this Twitter, and sometimes they make news that way, and I'm like, wait a second, you didn't tell me that. So I had to sign up, and I got it so that it pushes it as an SMS to my phone, so if you heard a beep, that's because the White House just sent out some tweet. And because I set up an account, I now have all these followers, even though I've never sent out a single one. I don't know.
And you're all welcome to join his followers.
Yeah.
Right.
Feel free, but it won't be a satisfying experience.
In the turquoise shirt.
So you mentioned that you're still going to rewrite the print edition of the New York Times.
Please.
Now that the New York Times has switched to the online subscription fee, what do you think will be the most successful business models of newspapers in the future, and what will the current use of this?
Yeah, I mean, let me just say on the paywall, look, I understand why there's some consternation about it, and I agree with the dream that all information should be free. I mean, that's a beautiful thing about the internet. At the same time, it's not free to have 1,000 reporters and editors traveling the world. I mean, you know, our guys in Libya are taking great risks to their lives, right? We have to pay for armored cars, for translators, for bulletproof vests. I mean, journalism costs money, and to do it right costs money. And you see the consequence of this in lots of papers that have given up, frankly, that kind of journalism. Dana Priest, who's going to be here today, did the story about Walter Reed and how the hospital was not treating the veterans coming back from the wars well. She spent a year on that, maybe even 2 years, I don't remember, and another reporter did, and editors did. That costs money. So unfortunately, the paywall is one effort to try to monetize this. I think that they've done it in a conservative way. You can have 20 articles a month without having to pay. You can come in through links, and that doesn't even count against your quota of 20. They're not trying to get the casual reader. They're not trying to get the tourist. They're trying to get the people who actually really like the New York Times and who really actually depend on the New York Times. And we're saying, help out a little bit, in effect. It's like, you know, alms at church. Please help out a little bit.
I didn't know that part about links not counting against your quota. Anyway,
yeah,
take
it's very loose, this thing. It's very loose. They have 30 million unique visitors a month, and this will affect less than 5% of them. Because either you're a print subscriber already, therefore you get it without any problem, or you come for links, or you come and you use less than 20. And they said today, I think they announced today, that they've got 100,000 digital subscribers now in the first few weeks. And $15 a month, I know it costs, that's money, but on the other hand, it's like, you know, a meal at McDonald's plus a Starbucks coffee. I mean, hopefully what we produce is of some value to people, and that they will find some value in that.
Well, we'll make sure that your editors back home know that you gave a ring endorsement of the new paywall.
Ringing endorsement of the paywall.
Yeah,
awesome idea.
Yes, right here.
Do you watch The West Wing?
I used to watch The West Wing, I did, and my sister-in-law used to write for it, so I'll disclose my conflict.
How accurate that is, as like the press room scenes and the press
Yeah, it's no TV show is accurate in the sense of it's not, you know, accurate as C-SPAN, and C-SPAN doesn't get the ratings that The West Wing got, right? But to the extent that Hollywood entertainment can capture what a White House is like, I think they did a pretty good job.
Yeah.
I think that what they captured about it were that these issues are hard, and that the people are hardworking, and that they are up against terrible dilemmas, and that and that it sometimes moves at the speed of lightning, and that there is an inherent conflict between idealism and reality, and that Washington is not as cynical or as evil as a lot of people think, but in fact filled with lots of people with good motives who sometimes do bad things, but are broadly trying to do what they think is right for the country. And I really like that show for that reason.
Time for one more question. Yeah, right here. Thanks.
Yeah, how has the Times overcome whatever it was, the way they were misled on the Iraq War buildup? How has the culture changed?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's a good question. The Times, ironically, faces the dilemma of being accused of being both in Bush's pocket and the most virulent anti-Bush paper out there, and somehow we're both of these things to different people. We recognize, I wasn't there at the time, so I can't give you a very good conversation about that. I think we recognize that we, the media, broadly failed to do as rigorous a job as we could have done. I mean, we should apply skepticism to anything government tells us, not Bush specifically, but anything. We should apply a healthy degree of skepticism and accountability. Having said that, we're not intelligence officers. We have no access to satellite data. We have no wiretaps. We don't. The newspapers don't have the capacity to determine whether or not Saddam Hussein had intelligence or had weapons of mass destruction. What we should have done was probably been more skeptical of the evidence that was produced and presented to us, and question more. But I mean, there are limits to what a newspaper or a news organization can do if the intelligence agencies that we report on, broadly have come to certain conclusions. So it's not to excuse anything. I think what we all took from that is a reminder that our job in society is to be to ask questions and to question authority, and that's true today as it was then.
We had one hand from Rachel at the same time, so Rachel does get the last question. Okay.
This might be a little bit of a complicated question, and I hate to go back to WikiLeaks. But how do you look at what's happening right now with private Manning and the way he's being treated, and how that is setting a precedent for the future, in terms of how we deal with people that we've been really from the inside of the government, and sort of maybe how in the future we'll look back on that as part of a long administration.
It's a good question. I mean, I can't, it's not for me to say how they should treat Private Manning. That's a policy decision that's not my call. I will say in general I like leakers, and anybody who's listening who has anything really good, let me know. And I'm in favor of protecting people.
No leaks on Professor Inboden's class. Okay.
And that, there is, whether he did the right thing or not, in general, there is a value to people who have played whistleblower over the years. And so I would, whether, again, not commenting on his case specifically, I would hate the message would be that, we never hear anything about what really goes on in government because people are too afraid. And that would be a terrible thing. President Obama, ironically, is while people might not have understood this about him, has prosecuted more leak cases than any president before him, as far as I understand. My colleague Jim Risen in the Bureau of the New York Times right now has been facing some trouble on a source for a book that he wrote. And I think we make the argument, have always made the argument that it's our job to pursue information that the government doesn't want you to have. Now there are obviously instances where that's not where that would be of danger to national security, and I think we should take that into account. And there are instances, Bob Woodward can tell you, of instances where he's learned all kinds of things that we haven't published because we were convinced that would damage national security. Having said that, the fact that General McChrystal asked for 80,000 troops is a policy decision, and while the government wanted to keep that quiet, and while President Obama would just as soon not have his hands tied because his generals made a recommendation, that's a political reason for keeping something secret, not a national security reason for keeping something secret. And we felt, and Bob Woodward felt when he broke that story, that this is information the public should have as part of its conversation about what we should do in Afghanistan.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're out of time. Please join me.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Thank you. Great.